The flight was just beginning, and passengers were settling into their seats. Emily zipped down the aisle, making quick work of the routine as she double-checked the overhead bins and adjusted her uniform. She had done this 1,000 times before, but today felt different. The buzz of the plane, full of people with their own stories, always filled her with a sense of purpose. But something about today left her feeling unsettled, as though something was going to happen. She just couldn't shake the feeling. She stopped by seat 22A and saw him, an elderly man, struggling to lift his bag into the overhead compartment, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his glasses with careful precision. His face was weathered with age, his white hair thin but neatly combed, his eyes sharp. Despite the years etched into his face, Emily watched him for a moment, the frustration creeping up inside her as the line behind him grew longer, and she could already hear the murmurs of impatient passengers. The seconds seemed to stretch into minutes. She cleared her throat and spoke with a forced smile. "Sir, can I help you with that?" He looked up slowly as if startled, but then gave her a kind smile. "No, thank you, I can manage," he replied, his voice soft yet steady despite his age. There was a calmness about him that made her pause for just a second, but the thought quickly passed as she shifted her weight and glanced over her shoulder. The line of passengers waiting was growing more visible. She took a deep breath and glanced at her watch. She couldn't afford delays, not now. The flight had to be on schedule. They were already running behind from earlier delays. She didn't have time for this. She had to move things along, so she tried again in a firmer voice. "Sir, if you don't mind, I really need to get the cabin cleared up." He gave a slight nod, as if to acknowledge her words, but didn't rush or change his pace. She could feel her patience wearing thin as she stood there watching him struggle. She muttered under her breath, just loud enough for him to hear, "Some people are just too slow." He didn't react, his hands still gently placed on his bag, as if every action was deliberate, his movements precise. In a way that felt deliberate yet impossibly slow, she glanced at him with a quick eye roll and moved to the next row of passengers with a deep exhale of frustration. But even as she walked away, something about his steady pace stuck in her mind. As the cabin filled and the flight continued, she tried to shake the lingering thoughts about the elderly man, but no matter how hard she focused on the other passengers, something kept drawing her back to him every time she passed his row. He seemed to be quietly watching her, no sign of distress or impatience, just those quiet eyes watching as she moved up and down the aisle. It was unsettling. In a way she couldn't quite put into words. She had dealt with all kinds of passengers in her time, but this man was different. There was something almost unnerving about the way he sat there, his posture straight, his eyes never wavering, even as she went about her tasks. Every time she looked up, he was still watching her with that unblinking gaze. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was studying her, and not in a way that felt casual. No, it was as if he was measuring her every move, testing her somehow, but testing her for what Emily couldn't figure it out. The more she thought about it, the more it gnawed at her. Why did he seem so calm, so certain of himself, while everyone else around him seemed frazzled and rushed? She thought back to the moment when he had quietly declined her offer of help. He hadn't needed it, but he had turned her down with such grace, as though he had seen it all before. Had he known something she didn't, or was she just overthinking it? She shook her head as she refocused on her duties, but a sense of unease lingered, a feeling she couldn't ignore, and all the while the elderly man sat there watching her from his seat, silent and still as if he had all the time in the world. The flight was steady now. The hum of the engines filled the air, and the bustle of the cabin seemed to settle into a routine. Emily moved through the aisles delivering snacks and drinks, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the elderly man who had quietly captivated her attention. She tried to focus on her tasks, but each time she passed his seat, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her with those piercing eyes. He was calm, so calm, that it felt almost unnatural, as if the entire world could be falling apart around him, and he would remain unfazed. As she served the other passengers, she couldn't help but glance in his direction once again this time. He was staring out the window, his face bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun, his expression unreadable. But there was something about the way he carried himself. It was almost like he belonged there, in the quiet stillness of the cabin, while the rest of the world rushed around him. The thought unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She moved to the back of the plane to refill the beverage cart, and when she came back through, she noticed something odd. The man hadn't moved, he hadn't touched his drink or his snack, or even looked at the small TV screen in front of him. Instead, he was sitting perfectly still, his hands resting gently in his lap, his posture impeccable. It was as though he had been frozen in time. And as Emily passed by again, she couldn't help but feel a strange pull to him. She paused just a moment too long, and he turned his head slowly to meet her eyes. For a brief moment, it felt as if the whole plane had gone silent, as if the air between them had thickened. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she could feel the weight of his gaze on her. Something about it made her heart skip a beat, and for the first time all day, she felt a cold chill run down her spine. The moment was fleeting, but it left a lingering sense of unease. She didn't know why, but she felt a strange pressure to look away, yet she couldn't. Her eyes locked with his, and she realized then that he wasn't just looking at her, he was studying her in the most deliberate way. Before she could break the connection, he spoke quietly, his voice low but clear. "Emily, you've been working hard all day." She blinked in surprise, not sure if she had heard him correctly. She stepped a little closer, unsure of what he meant. How did he know my name, she thought to herself. It was impossible he hadn't heard anyone call her by it. He couldn't have known. But there it was, he had spoken it without hesitation. She forced a smile, unsure of what else to do. "Yes, just a long day," she replied, her voice betraying her growing unease. But the man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply nodded and smiled back, a knowing smile, as if he understood more than she was willing to admit. But then, just as quickly as the moment had begun, he turned back to his window and returned to his stillness, leaving Emily standing there with a swirl of questions in her mind. She continued her duties, but the interaction weighed on her. The rest of the flight felt different now. The atmosphere in the cabin seemed charged. Somehow she couldn't stop thinking about him. And that strange exchange, had he somehow known her name from before, or was there something else to this moment? Was it all just her imagination working overtime, or was there more to this old man than she had initially assumed? Emily's mind raced as she moved through the rows of passengers, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. But no matter how much she focused on the job at hand, she couldn't escape the sense that something was off about him, something she couldn't quite place. She had worked on planes for years and met all kinds of passengers, but this man, he felt different. And for the first time in a long time, Emily began to wonder if perhaps she had misjudged him, if there was more to him than the simple appearance of an elderly traveller. As the hours passed, Emily tried to push the strange encounter from her mind, but it lingered like a shadow that wouldn't leave no matter how much she tried to focus on her tasks. The cabin was calm now, passengers quietly watching movies or reading books, but every time she passed the elderly man's seat, she felt an almost magnetic pull to him. She couldn't explain it, but there was something about him that made her uneasy yet intrigued at the same time. She glanced over at him once more as she made her way down the aisle. This time, he was still staring out the window, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, his shoulders straight, his hands resting calmly in his lap. His entire presence seemed to exude control and patience, a stark contrast to the restless energy of the other passengers, some of whom were fidgeting in their seats or tapping their feet in impatience. Emily moved quickly through the aisles, trying to distract herself, but even as she served drinks and snacks to the other passengers, she couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were always on her. Every time she looked up, he was there, his gaze following her movements, quietly studying her. It was starting to get under her skin in a way that felt wrong, but no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, she found herself drawn back to him over and over again. She was passing through the aisle again when she caught him looking at her once more. But this time there was something different in his expression. It wasn't just a quiet gaze or a neutral stare. It was a knowing look, as if he could see right through her, as if he knew everything about her, every thought, every feeling she had buried deep inside her chest. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she paused for a moment, frozen by his stare. She didn't know what to say or what to do. She had never been so aware of a passenger's gaze before, but there was something almost unsettling in the way he watched her. It felt like he was waiting for her to make a mistake or reveal something about herself that she hadn't meant to. Without warning, he spoke again, his voice soft but clear. "Emily, I've been flying for decades, you know." She froze mid-step, unsure how to respond. How could he possibly know that she had only been working for a few years? What was he implying? Her heart began to race as a wave of unease washed over her. She forced a smile and tried to maintain her composure. "Yes, I've been flying for a little while now," she replied, trying to sound casual, but the words felt hollow in her mouth. He smiled at her, his eyes twinkling in a way that felt almost too knowing, too wise. His gaze softened, but only slightly, as if he understood something she didn't. He didn't say anything else for a moment, and Emily couldn't help but wonder what he was thinking, what he was planning, or if this was all just a strange coincidence. But the tension in the air seemed to grow thicker with each passing second. The rest of the flight passed in a blur. Emily went through the motions of serving drinks and attending to passengers, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the elderly man. She couldn't help but wonder who he really was, what he wanted, and why he seemed so certain, so unbothered by everything around him, while the rest of the cabin seemed caught up in its own frenzy of little worries and small frustrations. As they began their descent into their destination, Emily's eyes flicked over to him one last time, and for the first time in hours he wasn't looking out the window or sitting perfectly still. He was looking directly at her again, his expression unreadable, yet somehow more intense than before. The moment stretched on, and for a brief second she felt the weight of his gaze more acutely than ever before. She quickly turned away and continued her duties, trying to shake the feeling of being watched, but she couldn't escape it. It was as if he was waiting for something to happen, waiting for her to make a mistake or reveal some hidden truth. And as the plane began its descent, she couldn't help but feel a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. As the plane began its descent, Emily tried to steady her nerves. The last few minutes of every flight were always the most tense, especially when it came to the final touches, getting everything prepared for landing and making sure passengers were securely fastened in their seats. But today was different. She couldn't stop thinking about the elderly man. He was still sitting there, as calm as ever, his eyes locked on her again. This time she didn't look away. She couldn't. His gaze seemed to pull her in like an invisible thread that tightened with every passing second. She reached the front of the plane and glanced back at his seat, but now he was no longer staring at her. He was looking down at something in his lap, his hands gently holding what looked like a leather-bound book. Emily couldn't help but wonder what he was reading. Was it something important, or just a distraction from the flight? She was about to ask him if he needed anything, but the words felt stuck in her throat. The tension in the air was too thick to cut through. The plane began to shake slightly as it made its final approach to the runway, and Emily's thoughts shifted to the task at hand. She moved to the back to ensure everything was in order when she heard the soft chime of the intercom. The captain's voice came through the speakers with a calm tone. "Good evening, folks. We'll be landing shortly. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and all your personal items are stowed properly as we prepare for arrival." The announcement did little to ease the building tension inside her. She found herself glancing back towards seat 22, again, only to find him still looking down at his book. But this time his face was different. There was a faint expression of concentration on his features, as if he were deep in thought, or perhaps remembering something long ago. Emily tried to focus on her tasks, but the feeling of unease returned stronger than ever. She couldn't explain it, but something about him made her feel like she was missing something crucial. Suddenly there was a soft cough from behind her, and she turned around to see another passenger standing up to stretch. Just as the elderly man's voice broke the silence, Emily, yes. He said her name again, as if they were already familiar. She froze, her heart skipped a beat, and she turned to face him. His eyes were calm, but there was a quiet intensity in them that made her stomach twist. "She've been working hard all day, haven't you?" He asked, his voice soft, but heavy with something that Emily couldn't place. She nodded quickly, trying to brush off the growing discomfort. "Yes, it's been a long day, but we're almost there." She forced a smile, but he didn't smile back. Instead, his expression seemed to darken slightly, as though he was measuring her response. He closed his book slowly and looked up at her as if expecting more, but Emily didn't know what else to say, so she nodded again and moved down the aisle, quickly trying to escape the weight of his gaze. But as she moved past his row, she heard him speak again. This time his voice was low and deliberate. "Emily, don't you find it strange how time works?" he asked. The words struck her like a sudden gust of wind. She paused in her tracks. Not sure how to respond, she turned back to look at him. His eyes were now fixed on her with an almost knowing look, as if he had just revealed something that only she could understand. She was taken aback by the question, but there was no time to ask him to elaborate before another passenger called out for assistance. She turned away from him again, but the question lingered in her mind. "Don't you find it strange how time works?" She couldn't shake it off. The words repeated over and over in her head, like an echo reverberating through her thoughts. What did he mean by that? And why had he said it to her? Why was he speaking to her? Like they were somehow connected, like there was something between them that no one else could see. The plane began to lower its altitude as the captain made another announcement, but Emily couldn't focus on the instructions anymore. Her thoughts were consumed by the elderly man and his strange words. Was this all just a bizarre encounter, or was there something more to it, a hidden message? She was too dense to catch. She looked back at him one last time, but this time his seat was empty, his belongings neatly stowed away as though he had never been there at all. As Emily continued down the aisle, she felt a sudden chill wash over her. It wasn't the usual cool air from the ventilation system. It was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She turned back again, glancing towards seat 22. But the elderly man was gone. There was no sign of him, nothing except the empty seat, his jacket neatly folded over the armrest, his bag tucked away under the seat in front of him. It was as though he had never been there to begin with. Her heart raced, and she stood still for a moment, trying to make sense of it all. Where had he gone? Had he gone to the restroom? Or was he somewhere else on the plane? She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something she hadn't yet figured out. She looked around, but no one seemed to notice anything strange. The other passengers were going about their business, getting ready for the final descent into the airport, but Emily couldn't focus. Her mind was still fixed on the old man and his cryptic words. "Don't you find it strange how time works?" She tried to push the thought aside, but it kept coming back no matter how much she focused on the other passengers or her responsibilities as a flight attendant. It was as if those words were echoing inside her mind. She didn't even realize how much time had passed before the plane's wheels touched down with a slight jolt. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, making the usual landing announcement, and Emily snapped back into reality. She moved quickly through the aisles, ensuring everything was in order before the final disembarkation. As the passengers began to stand and gather their things, Emily's heart still pounded in her chest. She couldn't understand why she felt so unsettled by what had happened. The elderly man's disappearance was only adding to the feeling of unease she had been carrying since their encounter. She glanced one last time at seat 22 as the aisle cleared and saw nothing but the empty seat. A feeling of disbelief washed over her. How could he have vanished so completely without anyone noticing? She didn't know what to think. The thought that he might have never existed crossed her mind, but she quickly dismissed it. It was impossible. He had spoken to her. She had heard his voice. She had felt his presence. So how could he have just disappeared like that? As the last passengers disembarked, Emily made her way toward the front of the plane. To speak with the captain, she needed answers. Something about all of this didn't make sense, and she had to figure out what was going on. When she reached the cockpit, she knocked lightly and stepped inside. The captain and co-pilot were both busy with their post-flight checks, but when they saw her, they smiled and nodded. "Hey, Emily," the captain said. "How was the flight? Everything go smoothly?" She hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to explain what had happened. But she had to ask about the elderly man, the one who had been sitting in seat 22. "Captain, I have a question," she began hesitantly. "Did we have a passenger in seat 22 today?" He glanced at the manifest before looking up at her with a puzzled expression. "Seat 22. He repeated. "We didn't have anyone there today." "Why do you ask?" Emily's breath caught in her throat. She stared at him for a moment, trying to process the words he had just said. But she could barely comprehend it. "You're sure?" She asked the question, coming out more desperate than she had intended. The captain nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Sure. I'm sure. There's no record of a passenger in that seat. It was empty from the start." Emily felt the world around her tilt, as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. She tried to speak, but no words came out. She looked back at the cockpit door, as if expecting to see the elderly man standing there smiling at her with that same knowing look that had unsettled her so much during the flight. But there was nothing there, just the quiet hum of the plane's systems as everything returned to its calm rhythm. She turned and walked away from the cockpit, her mind racing. How could this be possible? She had seen him. She had spoken to him. Hadn't she had it all been some strange dream or hallucination? Was she losing her mind? As she made her way to the exit gate, she glanced one last time at the empty seat 22A and felt the unmistakable presence of someone watching her. But when she turned to look, no one was there. Emily stood frozen for a moment, her pulse racing, as she glanced one last time at seat 22. There was nothing there, nothing but the emptiness that seemed to swallow everything around it. But it felt like something was there, something she couldn't see, something she couldn't touch. But it was watching her. She could feel it deep in her chest, the sensation of being observed. Even though no one was there, she quickly turned and made her way down the jet bridge, her heart still pounding with the weight of what had just happened. She tried to convince herself it was just a trick of the mind. Maybe she was just tired, or perhaps it was the stress of the long flight. But deep down she knew that wasn't it. Something about the whole situation felt too real to be dismissed so easily. She had seen him, she had heard him speak, and the way he had looked at her with that unblinking gaze, it felt too deliberate, too knowing. She couldn't let it go. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. She had missed something important. As she walked through the terminal, she pulled out her phone and checked the flight manifest again. She scrolled through the list of passengers, desperately hoping to find his name. But there was nothing, just a list of ordinary names, with no indication of the mysterious man who had sat in seat 22. The thought sent another wave of unease through her stomach. But she tried to stay calm. She must have been mistaken. Surely there was an explanation, a simple one. But she couldn't stop herself from wondering, what if there wasn't? What if something deeper was at play? She made her way to the crew lounge and sat down in a quiet corner, staring at her phone. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the flight, the man, and the question he had asked her. Don't you find it strange how time works? What had he meant by that? What kind of person could speak with such certainty and yet say so little? What was he trying to tell her? Her mind raced as she replayed every moment of the flight, every interaction she had with him. But no matter how much she tried to make sense of it, the pieces didn't fit. Something was missing, something just beyond her grasp. She felt a sudden rush of frustration, but at the same time she felt an undeniable pull to find out the truth, to understand what had happened, and why she felt so deeply affected by it. She stood up and paced the room, her eyes darting around as if expecting to see something in the shadows, something she had missed earlier. It wasn't like her to get so worked up over a single encounter. But this wasn't just any encounter. This was different. She had never felt so unsettled, so unnerved by a passenger. Before, what was it about him that made her feel so exposed, so vulnerable? She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to collect her thoughts, but it was no use. Suddenly she was jolted from her thoughts by a soft tap on her shoulder. She turned quickly to see another flight attendant standing there. Her name was Sarah, and she looked concerned. "Emily, are you all right?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle but full of curiosity. Emily nodded quickly, trying to force a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine, just tired." But Sarah didn't seem convinced. She stepped closer and lowered her voice. "Listen, I know this is going to sound weird, but did you hear anything strange today on the flight? Anything unusual about a passenger?" Emily blinked in surprise. Her heart skipped a beat. How did Sarah know about the man? She hadn't said a word to anyone about it. But Sarah's expression told her everything she needed to know. There was more going on here than she realized. "What do you mean?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah glanced around to make sure no one was listening, and then leaned in closer. "There's a rumor going around the crew lounge about a strange passenger who's been on our flights lately." She said, her voice low. "It's always the same description. Elderly man, very quiet, never speaks to anyone, but a few of us have noticed him. And now you're saying you saw him too." Emily's stomach dropped as Sarah continued. "But there's something else." Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "He never shows up on the manifest. No one knows where he comes from or where he goes. Some of the senior crew members have said they've seen him on multiple flights across different routes. It's like he's not supposed to be here." Emily felt a wave of nausea wash over her as Sarah's words sank in her mind, racing with the implications of what she had just heard. A man who didn't appear on any passenger list, a man who seemed to appear out of nowhere and vanish without a trace. It was like he wasn't even a part of the flight at all, like he existed outside the rules of the airline and the world itself. And the more Emily thought about it, the more she realized that the questions Sarah had raised were the same ones that had been eating at her ever since the flight. Emily stood there frozen as Sarah's words sank in like stones in her stomach. She couldn't breathe for a moment, the weight of the situation crashing down on her. A man who never appeared on the manifest, who seemed to be part of the flight, but also not part of it at all. She felt a chill run down her spine as Sarah's words echoed in her mind. And in that moment, something deep inside Emily clicked, a strange realization forming at the edges of her consciousness. But she pushed it away, too afraid to fully grasp it. Sarah continued speaking, her voice trembling just slightly. "This man, he's appeared on other flights, too, not just ours. A few of the older crew members have said they've seen him on different routes, on different planes. Always the same description. Elderly man, never makes a sound, just sits there, staring out the window. But the strange thing is no one can ever remember seeing him leave the plane. It's like he's never actually there. But he is at the same time." Emily's heart thudded painfully in her chest. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. But she wasn't ready to accept it, not yet. That's when Emily felt it again, the cold sensation at the back of her neck, the feeling of being watched. Her eyes darted around the crew lounge, as if expecting to see him standing in the corner, watching her with those intense eyes. But there was nothing, just the normal bustle of the lounge as other crew members chatted and relaxed. But Emily couldn't shake the sensation she was being observed, like he was there somewhere just out of her sight. Sarah noticed Emily's unease and took a step closer, her voice lowered to a whisper. "I know this sounds crazy, but there's been talk that he's not even real. Some think he's some kind of ghost. Or maybe something else, something we don't understand. Maybe he's stuck in some kind of loop on the flights, just going around and around without ever truly leaving the plane. But others think he's something more sinister, that he's not human at all, but something else, something that we can't see or explain. Emily felt her heart race faster with every word, but her mind couldn't accept what Sarah was saying. No, it didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. How could someone not appear on the manifest, and yet be present on the flight? How could they not leave when everyone else did? How could he just vanish into thin air? She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away, trying to focus on logic, trying to find an explanation. But nothing made sense, nothing at all. I have to find out who he is, Emily muttered to herself, more to convince herself than anyone else. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. What do you mean? She asked, but Emily was already walking toward the door of the lounge, a new sense of determination taking over her steps. She wasn't sure why, but she felt like she needed to know the truth. She had to see if she could catch him again. She couldn't let it go, not now, not after everything that had happened. Sarah called after her, but Emily didn't stop. She didn't look back. She was too focused on the feeling gnawing at her gut, the need to confront whatever this man was, to figure out why she felt so connected to him, why he had singled her out on the flight. She moved quickly through the terminal, her mind racing with possibilities, but no answers, no clarity, just confusion and dread. As she made her way back to the gate, where the plane was now parked waiting for its next flight, Emily's breath hitched. She could still feel it, the presence of something unseen, the sensation of being watched. And when she looked up, she swore she saw a figure standing near the door to the plane. But when she blinked, the figure was gone, replaced by the usual airport staff, going about their business. Her heart skipped a beat, and she took a step closer to the plane, trying to ignore the overwhelming sense of dread filling her chest. She stepped onto the aircraft slowly, as if something was warning her to turn back. But she didn't listen. The cabin was empty, eerily empty. There were no passengers, no crew members, just the quiet hum of the systems and the faint smell of recycled air. She moved down the aisle cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the silence. And then she saw it, a piece of paper crumpled on the floor, just a few rows from where she had seen the man sit, before Emily bent down to pick it up, her hands shaking slightly as she unfolded it carefully. What she saw made her blood run cold. Written in bold black letters were the words "Time ASNT." What did ATSEEMs? Emily stood frozen, holding the crumpled piece of paper in her hand, her mind racing, as the words "time isn't what it seems" stared up at her. She felt a coldness settle in her bones, like the room itself had grown colder. She could barely breathe. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper further, but there was nothing else on it, no signature, no other instructions, just those 3 words that seemed to resonate in the air like a warning. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she slowly straightened and looked around the empty cabin. Once more everything was still and silent. The sound of her own breathing seemed amplified in the quiet. She stepped further into the aisle, her heart pounding harder with each footstep. Unsure of what to do or where to go, she tried to calm herself, to remind herself that she was just being paranoid. But the gnawing feeling at the pit of her stomach wouldn't go away. It was as if something was pulling her deeper into the mystery. She glanced down at her phone again, the flight manifest still open. She scrolled through the list of passengers, as if searching for some clue, anything that could explain what was happening. But nothing stood out. There were no anomalies, no strange names, no indication of the elderly man who had been on her flight just hours ago. Her eyes moved back to the paper in her hand. Time isn't what it seems. The words echoed in her mind again and again, like a riddle she couldn't solve. Emily turned to the cockpit door and hesitated. She needed to know more. She needed answers. She had to speak to the captain again to figure out what was going on. But as she moved toward the front of the plane, her foot caught on something, and she stumbled forward, catching herself. Just before hitting the floor, her breath caught in her throat as she looked down at what had tripped her. A small object had fallen from under one of the seats. She knelt down and picked it up. It was an old pocket watch, tarnished and worn with age. The glass was cracked, and the metal had a dull sheen, But there was something about it that felt oddly familiar. It was as if she had seen it before seen it, in the hands of someone she couldn't quite place her fingers, grazed over the cool surface of the watch. And for a moment, the air around her seemed to thicken. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she turned the watch over in her hand. There was an engraving on the back of the watch, small delicate letters etched into the surface. She leaned in closer to read it. The words were faint but legible. Time waits for no one. She felt her pulse spike again as the words settled into her mind. The same feeling of dread that had been creeping up her spine now rushed through her entire body. It was as though everything was starting to collapse in on itself, the walls of logic and reason breaking apart around her. Before she could think any further, her phone vibrated in her pocket. Startling her, she quickly pulled it out, expecting a call from Sarah or the captain. But it was a text message from an unknown number. The message was simple, just a single line of text. "You've seen it now, haven't you?" She froze, her breath caught in her throat. Who could have sent this? She didn't recognize the number, and yet the message seemed to know everything she was thinking, everything she had just been feeling. It was as if someone was watching her right now. Her hands shook as she typed a response. "Who is this?" But before she could press send, another message popped up immediately. "Time will find you soon." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She felt a cold sweat form on her brow as she looked around the empty plane. Once more she was alone. No one else was here. Yet she felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched, the feeling that something or someone was waiting for her. The overhead lights flickered once and then twice, as if responding to the tension in the air. The silence was broken by a sudden clatter from the back of the plane, like something heavy had fallen to the floor. Emily jumped in shock. Her eyes darted to the back of the cabin. But there was nothing there, just the rows of empty seats and the dark shadows cast by the dim lighting. She could feel it now, something closing in on her, something she couldn't explain, but it was there in the air around her, tightening like a noose. Every breath she took seemed harder to make, as if the very atmosphere was growing thicker, colder, heavier. She looked back down at the pocket watch still clenched in her hand, the engraving burning into her mind. Time waits for no one. Her phone buzzed again this time. The message was different. "We are all stuck here." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. And for the first time, Emily realized with a terrible clarity that she might not be alone at all. She might be a part of something far bigger, something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined.